Camping alone was supposed to be peaceful. I had done it plenty of times before, just me, my tent, and the deep silence of the wilderness. No people. No noise. Just the calm isolation of nature. That's what I was looking for when I drove 5 hours into the mountains, past the last gas station, down winding dirt roads until I reached the edge of the national forest. My plan was simple: hike 10 miles in, set up camp by the river, and spend a quiet weekend away from the world. No distractions. No one knowing exactly where I was. That had always been the appeal. It should have been perfect. But by the first night, I knew something was wrong. The hike was harder than I expected. The sun was already setting by the time I reached the river. I barely had enough light left to pitch my tent and get a fire going. By the time I settled in, the woods had grown unnaturally quiet. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, the smell hit me. Rot. Thick. Wet. Like something had been left to decay nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the campsite, expecting to see the bloated body of a dead animal somewhere in the brush. Nothing. Just the trees, the river, and the distant outline of my car, parked half a mile up the ridge. But the smell didn't fade. It clung to the air like something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination. That the smell would pass. Then I saw the footprints. They were just past the edge of my camp. Deep in the dirt, leading straight toward my tent. Bare feet. Too large. Too long. And they didn't leave. Whoever, or whatever, had walked into my camp had never walked away. I barely slept that night. Every crunch of leaves, every shift in the wind sent adrenaline pumping through my veins. But nothing happened. The next morning, the smell was gone. And so were the footprints. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the wind had shifted the dirt. Maybe I was just exhausted from the long hike. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder as I boiled water for my coffee. The river looked different in the daylight, too still, too reflective. Like a sheet of glass stretching out between the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure standing on the other side of the river. At first, I thought it was a hiker. Someone else who had wandered too deep into the woods. But as I squinted against the glare of the sun, my stomach dropped. It was me. The same clothes. The same stance. But its head was tilted too far to the side. Its mouth wasn't moving. It was just standing there. Staring. I blinked, and it was gone. The trees were empty again. The water perfectly undisturbed. Like nothing had been there at all. I packed up my camp within 10 minutes. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back should have taken me 3 hours. Instead, it took me 6. The trail had changed. I knew I was going the right way. I had marked the trees on my way in, carved small X's into the bark with my knife. But every mark was gone. The path twisted in ways I didn't recognize. The trees pressed in closer, casting long shadows even though the sun was still high. Then the whistling started. Soft. Faint. 3 notes. Then a pause. Then 3 more. Coming from ahead of me. The moment I heard it, my entire body locked up. I turned slowly, heart pounding, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing. The forest was still. Too still. I forced myself forward. The whistling followed. Always just out of sight. Always too close. Then I saw the cabin. It was just sitting there, in the middle of the woods. No roads leading to it. No trails. The roof sagged, the windows dark and empty. And the front door. Wide open. A shape moved inside. A shadow, long and wrong. I turned and ran. By the time I reached my car, the sun had almost set. I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Relief crashed over me like a wave. Then, from the rearview mirror, I saw something step out of the trees. Tall. Thin. Moving in that same unnatural way. It didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It just stood there. Watching. Waiting. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest. But even now, weeks later, I still hear it sometimes. That soft, slow whistling. Coming from just outside my window. We weren't supposed to be in that part of the forest. There were plenty of official trails in the national park, but Derek always had to push it further. He wanted to go beyond the marked paths, deeper into the wilderness, somewhere untouched. "Come on, man," he said, grinning as he adjusted his pack. "Think of it as an adventure. Real camping, not just some tourist hike." I should have said no. But I didn't. That was my first mistake. We hiked all day, cutting through dense forest with nothing but a topographic map and a compass to guide us. The deeper we went, the quieter the woods became. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just the sound of our boots crunching on dry twigs. It was late afternoon when we found the path. It wasn't a real trail, just a narrow, overgrown stretch of land where the trees seemed to bend inward, forming a tunnel of gnarled branches. Something about it made my stomach twist. Derek, of course, wanted to follow it. "Man, this is exactly what I was hoping to find," he said, stepping onto the path. I hesitated. "I don't know, dude. Something about this feels wrong." He laughed. "That's the whole point. Come on, let's check it out. If it leads nowhere, we'll turn back." I sighed, adjusting my pack. "Fine. But we don't go too far." That was my second mistake. The further we walked, the stranger the forest became. The trees weren't just twisted, they were burned. Blackened bark, like they had been caught in a fire years ago. But there was no smell of smoke, no fallen branches, no signs of recent damage. Just those charred trees, stretching on for miles. "Weird," Derek muttered, running a hand over the rough bark. "Feels almost soft." I didn't want to touch them. The air felt heavy. Like the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on me. Then we found the clearing. At first, I thought it was a good place to camp, flat, open, no thick underbrush. Then I saw the circles. Rocks, placed in perfect rings, 6 of them. Each one wider than the last, forming a pattern too precise to be natural. In the center of the ring stood a single dead tree. Tall. Blackened. And at the base of the tree, bones. Small ones. Scattered in the dirt like someone had picked them clean. My entire body went cold. "Derek," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." He wasn't listening. He was staring at the tree. His hands hung limply at his sides, his eyes wide and unfocused. Like he was in a trance. "Derek," I repeated, grabbing his shoulder. The moment I touched him, he gasped, his entire body jerking back like he had been electrocuted. "Dude, what the hell?" he whispered, shaking his head. "You were just standing there," I said. His eyes flickered to the tree. Then to the bones. "We need to go," he said. For once, I didn't argue. We turned back the way we came, walking fast. Then, the whistling started. A slow, deliberate tune. 3 notes. Then a pause. Then 3 more. I stopped cold, my pulse thundering. It was coming from behind us. From the clearing. Derek grabbed my arm. "Walk faster." We didn't talk. Didn't turn around. We just moved. The sun was dipping lower now, the shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Every step I took, I expected to hear footsteps behind us. But there was nothing. Just that awful whistling. Growing closer. We broke into a run. The twisted trees blurred past, the burned bark flashing in the dim light. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Then, the trail was gone. We skidded to a stop, panting. The narrow path we had followed was just gone. Like it had never been there at all. Derek spun in a slow circle, his face pale. This doesn't make sense." My chest tightened. We were lost. The whistling stopped. For a moment, the entire forest was silent. Then, the laughter. Low. Distant. But not human. It came from all around us. Derek grabbed my wrist, his grip vice-like. Run. We ran. I don't know how long. Minutes. Hours. The sun was almost gone now, the sky fading into a deep, suffocating blue. And then, through the trees, a cabin. It sat in a clearing, small and crooked, its windows dark. I didn't care how strange it looked. It was shelter. Derek grabbed the handle and shoved the door open, pulling me inside. The moment we stepped over the threshold, the air changed. The forest noises, gone. The laughter, the wind, the snapping branches, all of it disappeared. Like we had stepped into another world. I turned to shut the door. And then, something moved outside the window. A figure. Tall. Wrong. Standing just beyond the tree line. Its head tilted slowly, its face impossibly stretched. The cabin floorboards creaked beneath us. The room grew darker. Derek whispered something I couldn't understand. His voice was flat. Distant. I turned. And he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the wall. His lips moving soundlessly. Like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Derek. I stepped closer. He didn't blink. His mouth kept moving. I grabbed his arm. Derek. His body jerked violently. Then, his eyes snapped to mine. We can't leave. My blood ran cold. What? He swallowed hard. It won't let us. Something thumped against the window. Once. Then twice. Slow. Patient. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was closer now. Its head tilted further, its mouth curved into a grin too wide for its face. I backed away. Derek, we need to run. He didn't move. His face was pale, his hands shaking. We're already in, he whispered. My stomach twisted. In what? I asked, my voice barely audible. He turned toward me, his pupils too large. Too empty. The circle. The door slammed shut behind us. The moment I saw the cabin, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't on the map. We had been hiking for nearly 6 hours, following an old trail deep into the national forest. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and we still hadn't found a good spot to set up camp. That's when we stumbled across it. A small, wooden cabin, sitting in a clearing where no structure should be. Derek and I stopped at the edge of the tree line, staring at it in silence. You see this, right? I asked, my voice low. Yeah, Derek muttered. I don't like it. Neither did I. The cabin looked old, too old. The wood was warped and darkened from years of exposure, the windows covered in grime. But the worst part? The door was open. Just a crack. Like it was waiting for us. Let's keep moving, I said, adjusting my pack. Derek hesitated. We should check inside. I gave him a sharp look. Why the hell would we do that? He shrugged. Maybe there's gear. Supplies. It's getting dark, man. If it's empty, we can stay here for the night instead of pitching the tent. I didn't like it. Every instinct in me screamed to leave that place alone. But against my better judgment, I followed Derek toward the cabin. The air felt thicker as we approached, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Derek pushed the door open with the end of his hiking pole. It creaked loudly, the sound cutting through the silence. Inside, the cabin was empty. No furniture. No signs that anyone had been here in years. Just 4 wooden walls, a dirt-covered floor, and a smell, something damp, something rotting. I stepped inside cautiously, my boots scuffing against the old floorboards. See? Derek said. Nothing here. We can. Then we heard it. A thump from beneath us. We both froze. Another thump. Rhythmic. Slow. I turned to Derek, my throat dry. What the hell was that? He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted downward. To the trapdoor in the floor. It had been hidden beneath a layer of dirt, barely visible. But now that we saw it, it was unmistakable. A wooden hatch, secured with a rusted iron latch. Another thump. From underneath. Derek took a step back. Nope. Nope. Not dealing with this. For once, I agreed with him. We turned and bolted out of the cabin, practically sprinting back toward the tree line. I didn't look back. Didn't stop until we were a solid mile away. Only then did I realize something that made my blood run cold. The door. When we first saw the cabin, the door was open. But when we ran, it had been closing. By itself. I don't know what was in that trapdoor. I don't want to know. We set up camp far away from that place. And in the middle of the night, as I lay awake in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, I swore I could still hear it. That slow, steady thump. Somewhere in the distance. Somewhere closer than before. The ranger at the outpost barely looked up when we signed in. That far out, he muttered, shaking his head. Not many people camp there anymore. Derek grinned. That's the point. The ranger didn't smile. He just sighed, scribbled something in his logbook, and handed back our permits. Just stay on the trail. And if you hear anything at night, don't go looking. I should have listened. We hiked for about 6 hours, deeper into the wilderness than I had ever been. No cell service, no signs of other people, just the endless stretch of trees and the crunch of our boots against the dirt. The air smelled fresh, untouched. Feels like we have the whole world to ourselves, Derek said, adjusting his pack. I nodded, but something about the thought unsettled me. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was starting to dip. The clearing was perfect, flat ground, a freshwater stream nearby, and enough tree cover to keep the wind from biting too hard. We set up the tent, built a fire, and cooked dinner as the sky darkened. It was peaceful. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard the whistling. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. A slow, deliberate tune, 3 notes, then a pause. Then 3 more. I thought it was the wind at first. Then I saw Derek sit up. You hear that? He whispered. I nodded, my skin prickling. We listened. The whistling came again. Closer. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing. Just the endless blackness of the woods. Probably just the wind, Derek muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We didn't sleep well that night. By morning, the air felt off. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just an unnatural stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. I went to grab my boots outside the tent and froze. They had been moved. Not just shuffled around, placed neatly side by side, facing the trees. Derek, I called, my voice unsteady. He stepped out of the tent, rubbing his eyes. What? I pointed at the boots. His face paled. You do that? I asked. He shook his head. We packed up faster than we ever had before. By midday, we were deep in the hike back. We hadn't spoken much, just walked, glancing over our shoulders every few minutes. Then we saw the footprints. Bear. Human. Leading alongside our trail. But here's what made my stomach drop. They weren't ours. And worse. They were facing the wrong way. Like someone had been following us all night. Neither of us said a word. We just walked faster. Then, late in the afternoon, Derek stopped so suddenly I nearly ran into him. I followed his gaze up the ridge ahead. A figure stood at the top. Motionless. Watching. My breath hitched. Hello. I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. Derek grabbed my arm. Keep walking. We didn't look back. That night, we made camp again, not because we wanted to, but because we had no choice. It was getting too dark to navigate the trail. We built a fire and sat with our backs to the tent, watching the woods, listening. Then. The whistling. Right outside the firelight. I grabbed my knife, my pulse pounding in my ears. A twig snapped. Derek's breathing was ragged. "We're not alone," he whispered. Then, laughter. Soft. Almost playful. I've never felt fear like that before. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, staring into the trees, waiting for the sun to save us. By dawn, the woods were silent again. But when we turned toward the tent, it was gone. Not ripped apart. Not destroyed. Just gone. Like it had never been there at all. Derek turned to me, his face pale. "Run." We ran. Didn't look back. Didn't stop. By the time we reached the outpost, we were gasping for air. The ranger looked up as we stumbled inside, his eyes narrowing. "You heard the whistling, didn't you?" We nodded, too exhausted to speak. He sighed, shaking his head. "You're lucky. Most people don't make it back." Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.